Meanwhile, European Union foreign ministers have met again in Brussels to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. It threatens to escalate into war between Ukraine and Russia. Let's find out from our correspondent in Europe, Malou Francisco, if the EU will impose sanctions on Russia.
European Union foreign ministers held out the threat of sanctions against Russia if Moscow fails to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. At talks on the Ukraine crisis in Brussels, the foreign ministers agreed no deadlines or details about any punitive measures that could be put in place against Russia. But the leaders of the EU's 28 member countries will hold an emergency summit on Thursday and could take further decisions. The EU discussions were convened abruptly after Russian President Vladimir Putin seized the Crimean Peninsula and said he had the right to invade Ukraine.
We call on Russia to immediately withdraw its troops to the areas where they are permanently stationed on the basis of the agreement for the Black Sea Fleet stationed in Ukraine. We also call on Russia to agree to the request of Ukraine to hold consultations and to take part in urgent consultations amongst all signatories and adherents of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994.
Ashton said the European Union wanted the situation to de-escalate to the position that troops had before the situation began.
In the absence of de-escalating steps by Russia, the EU will decide what the consequences will be for bilateral relations between the European Union and Russia. We talked about the potential of suspending bilateral talks on visa matters on the new agreement, and we will consider targeted measures.
Germany, France and Britain, the EU's most powerful nations, were advocating mediation, possibly via the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, while not ruling out economic measures if Moscow does not cooperate. One possible measure mentioned by the European foreign ministers after their meeting was to suspend talks on visa issues with Russia. Russia and the European Union have been discussing visa cooperation since 2007, with Russia keen to have visa-free access to the EU's member states. It's an issue raised at nearly every meeting between Moscow and Brussels. Swedish Ambassador Carl Bildt called Russia's action an aggression and called on Russian leaders to reconsider.
I think the combination of the international interaction that he's now seeing, I mean, that's the European Union, that's the United States, that others should have people in the Russian leadership to reconsider. I mean, they've launched a course of aggression against a neighboring country. We haven't had aggression, that word used, on the territory of Europe for decades, thank God. And of course it's going to have major repercussions well beyond what we can take formal decisions on if it goes further. I would hope that that will cause sensible people in Russia to reconsider.
Relations between Brussels and Moscow have deteriorated over the last year, with the EU governments expressing anger over Moscow's pressure on former Soviet republics, hoping to forge closer economic ties with Europe, including Ukraine. Tensions reached new heights when Moscow persuaded the Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych to reject a trade deal with the EU in November, a decision that sparked 3 months of mass protests that ended with his overthrow. From the EU member, the Netherlands, Malou Francisco, for the Eagle News Service.